Everyone in these photographs believed there would be another morning, another train, another chance to come home. A captain stood on the bridge of a new ocean liner. Children held small suitcases while their parents tried not to cry. Astronauts smiled and waved as cameras followed them toward the launch pad. We know what happened next. They did not. That difference changes every face in the frame. These are not simply photographs taken before disasters. They preserve the last ordinary seconds before private lives became part of public history. Look closely, because sometimes a final goodbye does not look like goodbye at all. Captain Edward Smith had crossed the Atlantic many times, but this departure was meant to crown his career. On April 10, 1912, Titanic pulled away from Southampton with New York, wading across the ocean. Crowds watched from the quay, while tugboats guided the enormous liner into open water. Nothing in the photograph announces catastrophe. Smoke rises, passengers gather at the rails, and the ship appears exactly as promised: powerful, modern, and secure. After stops at Cherbourg and Queenstown, Titanic sailed west. 5 nights after leaving Southampton, Smith, more than 1,500 passengers and crew, and the ship itself were gone. 3 years later, another famous liner prepared to cross the Atlantic. Lusitania left New York on May 1, 1915, bound for Liverpool, while Europe was at war. German warnings had appeared in American newspapers, cautioning travelers that ships flying the British flag could become targets. Yet the terminal still filled with passengers, trunks, and farewells. The liner had completed more than 200 crossings, and routine can make danger feel distant. On May 7th, a German submarine torpedoed Lusitania off the Irish coast. She sank in about 18 minutes. The people waving from New York had watched nearly 1,200 victims begin their final voyage. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Sophie arrived in Sarajevo for an official visit on their wedding anniversary. Earlier that morning, a bomb thrown at their motorcade had missed their car and wounded others behind them. The couple continued to the town hall, then decided to visit the injured at hospital. A change of route was not properly communicated. When the driver stopped and attempted to reverse, 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip stood only a few steps away. He fired twice. Photographs made shortly before the shooting show a ceremonial visit, still proceeding as if order had survived. Within weeks, Europe entered a war that would destroy 4 empires and millions of lives. The Romanov family albums do not look like records of a collapsing dynasty. They show Nicholas and Alexandra with their children on boats, in gardens, and during quiet afternoons. In March 1917, Nicholas II abdicated as revolution overturned the world around them. The family was placed under guard at the Alexander Palace, then moved east to Tobolsk, and later to Ekaterinburg. Even in captivity, the photographs retain the habits of family life: reading, walking, standing together for the camera. In July 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 attendants were killed. The informal family pictures became evidence of a vanished household and the end of Imperial Russia. Robert Falcon Scott and 4 companions reached the South Pole on January 17, 1912. Instead of being first, they found the Norwegian flag left by Roald Amundsen, who had arrived more than a month earlier. The British party turned back across hundreds of miles of ice, already weakened and short of supplies. Edgar Evans died first. Lawrence Oates, fearing he was slowing the others, walked out of the tent during a blizzard and did not return. Scott, Edward Wilson, and Henry Bowers died later in their final camp. The photographs taken before the southern journey show confidence, careful preparation, and friendship. None reveal how narrow the distance between exploration and disappearance had become. When Endurance left Britain in August 1914, Europe had just gone to war. Ernest Shackleton offered his ship and crew to the government, but was instructed to continue toward Antarctica. Families watched men sail away for an expedition expected across the continent. Instead, Endurance became trapped in Weddell sea ice before the crossing could begin. For months, Frank Hurley photographed the ship as pressure slowly crushed her hull. The crew abandoned her, camped on moving ice, then escaped in small boats. Shackleton's open boat journey brought rescue, and every member of the Weddell Sea Party survived. Their departure was still a final goodbye. No one ever saw Endurance afloat again. In January 1943, photographer Jack Delano raised his camera inside Chicago's Union Station. A soldier bent toward his girlfriend for a goodbye kiss. Their names were not recorded. That absence makes the photograph larger than one couple. Across the station, servicemen waited beneath departure boards while families measured time in minutes. Delano did not arrange the embrace or explain what happened afterward. He preserved the uncertainty. The train might have carried this soldier to training, to another continent, or eventually back home. The image does not tell us. It captures the moment before every possible future, separated into the one they would actually live. After the violence of Kristallnacht in November 1938, Britain agreed to admit Jewish children threatened by Nazi persecution. The program became known as the Kindertransport. Nearly 10,000 children traveled from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and nearby territories to Britain. Parents packed small cases, labeled coats, and stood on platforms, knowing they could not travel with them. Some children believed the separation would last only a few weeks. For many, the railway platform became the final place they saw their mother or father. The photographs show ordinary objects carrying unbearable weight: a numbered tag, a toy, a hand through a carriage window, and adults trying to smile until the train moved. In May 1942, Dorothea Lange photographed the Mochita family waiting for an evacuation bus in Hayward, California. Each person wore an identification tag. Officials said the tags would keep families together during removal, but the image also shows how quickly citizens could be converted into numbers. The Mochitas operated a nursery and 5 greenhouses. They were among roughly 112,000 people of Japanese ancestry forced from the West Coast under wartime orders. Nearly 70,000 were American citizens. Families sold businesses, farms, and possessions with little time. Their goodbye was not to a person. It was to a home, a livelihood, and the expectation that citizenship guaranteed freedom. On the night before D-Day, soldiers gathered at airfields and ports across southern England. Some wrote letters, others checked equipment, posed for photographs, or listened to one final briefing. At Greenham Common, General Eisenhower spoke with paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division before they boarded aircraft for Normandy. Elsewhere, a final roll call was taken before men entered landing craft. The photographs are full of forced ease, cigarettes, painted faces, overloaded uniforms, and brief smiles. By the end of June 6, 1944, Allied casualties numbered in the thousands. For many families, a letter or photograph made before embarkation became the last new image that would ever arrive. On Tinian in the early hours of August 6, 1945, the crew of the B-29 Enola Gay prepared for a mission described to most of them only in fragments. The aircraft carried an atomic bomb called Little Boy. Photographs show crewmen beside the polished fuselage, surrounded by the familiar routine of an airbase. Hours later, Hiroshima had become the first city attacked with a nuclear weapon. Tens of thousands died immediately, and many more died from injuries and radiation by the end of the year. The crew returned to Tinian. For the people beneath their flight path, an ordinary summer morning had ended. History had entered the atomic age without asking anyone to pose for the final photograph. In 1947, children from Hungary arrived in the Netherlands to recover from the hunger and disruption left by war. Dutch foster families gave them food, safety, and a temporary home. 6 months later, the children were prepared to return to Hungary. A photograph made in Volendam in June 1948 shows the farewell beginning again. Children with luggage, foster parents leaning close, and the confusion of leaving people who had become family. This goodbye did not end in disaster. It reveals another consequence of history. Rescue can create attachments that departure must break. The children were returning home, yet home no longer meant only one place. In December 1950, United Nations forces and Korean civilians crowded the port of Hungnam as Chinese forces advanced during the Korean War. Ships evacuated troops, equipment, and refugees, while the city burned behind them. The cargo ship Meredith Victory, designed for a small crew, carried more than 14,000 civilians to safety. Families boarded with almost nothing, uncertain whether relatives left behind were alive or whether they would ever return north. The voyage ended at Gyeonggi Island on Christmas Day. For many passengers, the harbor was the last view of their hometown. The Korean peninsula remains divided, turning a hurried wartime evacuation into a separation that has lasted across generations. Before dawn on August 13, 1961, East German forces sealed streets and rail lines between East and West Berlin. Barbed wire appeared where people had crossed freely the day before. Families woke on opposite sides of a border that had not existed when they went to sleep. Early photographs show people waving across streets, standing at windows and calling to relatives they could no longer reach. The temporary wire became concrete, guard towers, and a deadly controlled zone. Some families would wait years for another meeting. Others would never have one. The gesture in these photographs is simple, but the distance behind it was political, physical, and deeply personal. Apollo 1 was scheduled to become the first crewed flight of the Apollo program. On January 27, 1967, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee entered the command module at Launch Complex 34 for a ground test. Photographs from the preceding weeks show the 3 astronauts at the pad, inside simulators, and smiling during public appearances. They expected to launch 25 days later. Instead, a fire spread through the oxygen-filled cabin during the test. The inward opening hatch could not be opened in time. All 3 men died. The investigation forced NASA to redesign the spacecraft, wiring, materials, and hatch. Their unfinished mission changed the machines that later carried astronauts to the moon. On the morning of January 28, 1986, the 7 members of Challenger's crew left their quarters and walked toward the vehicle that would carry them into orbit. Teacher Krista McAuliffe smiled and waved. Cameras recorded the ritual because astronaut walkouts had become familiar, almost reassuring. Challenger launched at 11:38 in unusually cold conditions. 73 seconds later, the shuttle broke apart after a failed seal and the right solid rocket booster allowed hot gas to escape. The final walkout became one of the most painful pieces of television in the space age. Its power comes from what the crew could not know and what everyone watching now cannot forget. A camera cannot predict the future. It records light, faces, and a fraction of a second. Meaning arrives later. That is why these photographs feel different once we know the stories behind them. A hand raised from a ship, a child beside a suitcase, or an astronaut's wave becomes a final message only in retrospect. Most people in these images were not trying to make history. They were trying to leave, return, survive, or reassure someone they loved. Their photographs remind us that history's largest events are always made from private moments, and that an ordinary goodbye can become permanent before anyone understands what it means.